Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. Derinkuyu, Chapter 1. There is a particular quality to the light in central Turkey in early autumn. The sun hangs lower than you might expect, casting everything, the pale hills, the strange stone towers rising from the plateau, in a warm amber wash. The air smells of dust, dry grass, and something older, a mineral scent that rises from the earth itself, as though the ground is exhaling. In the small town of Derinkuyu, in the province of Nevşehir, in the heart of a region of the world called Cappadocia, a man was renovating his home in 1963. We do not know his name. Not a single record preserved it. He is simply a man going about the ordinary business of improving his living space, who raised a sledgehammer and swung it into a basement wall, and the wall gave way. Behind it was not simply a cavity. There was a room. Behind the room, a tunnel. Behind the tunnel, more tunnels, and then chambers, staircases, wells, stables, kitchens, wine presses, churches, schoolrooms, storage vaults, and more staircases going deeper down through 18 levels of hand-carved volcanic rock to a depth of roughly 85 meters, the equivalent of a 25-story building, inverted, buried in darkness beneath the earth. The man had found a city, an intact three-dimensional city, entirely underground, hidden so completely that the modern town of Derinkuyu had been built over it without anyone knowing, without anyone feeling the hollow enormity beneath their feet. Derinkuyu is one of the most extraordinary things human beings have ever made. Tens of thousands of people, their breath, their livestock, their prayers, their sleeping children, all contained within a mountain of rock, sealed behind doors of stone, invisible to the world above. Not for a season, not for a decade, but for millennia. That is what we will explore tonight. Chapter 2. The Land That Made It Possible. To understand Derinkuyu, you must understand the earth it was carved from, and for that, you must go back to a time before any human being walked across the Anatolian plateau. Cappadocia sits within what geologists call the Central Anatolian Volcanic Province, shaped over millions of years by some of the most dramatic volcanic activity on the Eurasian continent. The region's high plateau, over 1,000 meters above sea level, is ringed by now extinct volcanoes. Mount Erciyes at 3,917 meters, still snow-capped for much of the year. Mount Hassan to the southwest at 3,268 meters. And the smaller but significant Mount Golada. These were not mild, effusive volcanoes producing slow lava flows, They were explosive, pyroclastic monsters capable of hurling superheated clouds of ash and gas into the stratosphere. They did this repeatedly through the Miocene and Pliocene epoch, roughly 10 to 3 million years ago. Eruption after eruption deposited material across the surrounding landscape. The primary product was volcanic ash, accumulating in layers that in some places reached 150 meters deep. Loose volcanic ash is useless for architecture. It blows away, washes out, collapses at a touch. But given time and pressure, it does something remarkable. It compacts. Silica and other minerals bound the particles together over geological timescales, forming a new kind of rock. Geologists call it tuff, from the Italian word for the same material found near southern Italy's volcanoes. In Turkish, peritaşa, or fairy stone. Tuff is peculiar stuff, soft enough to scratch with the fingernail, shapeable with simple iron tools. Ancient quarrymen could cut it almost like wood, and yet in dry conditions, Cappadocia has a continental climate with hot summers and cold winters and very little rain. Tuff is structurally stable. A carved chamber holds its shape for millennia, provided the ceiling is properly designed and the load above distributed correctly. The rock is also porous, exchanging air slowly with its surrounding, maintaining a consistent interior temperature and humidity. This combination, soft enough to carve easily, stable enough to persist, porous enough to breathe, made Cappadocian tuff uniquely suited to underground living. The people who built Derinkuyu were not geniuses triumphing over impossible material. They were intelligent people who recognized an extraordinary gift and used it wisely. Volcanic activity gave Cappadocia something else too. One of the strangest landscapes on the surface of the earth. As the tuff accumulated, harder materials like lava flow, basalt, ignimbrite sheets cooled on top of it in uneven patterns. Then erosion set to work. Wind and water ate away at the soft tuff while leaving the harder caps in place. Where basalt and andesite cap sat atop a column of tuff, the column survived while everything around it was stripped away. The result is the fairy chimney, those cone-shaped spires dotting the Cappadocian landscape by the thousands, some reaching 40 meters high, each crowned with a darker stone cap like a mushroom. They are among the natural wonders of the world, and for the people who lived here, they were also real estate. Long before anyone dug Derinkuyu, families had been carving homes, storage rooms, churches, and dovecotes directly into these formations. The chemistry of the tuff explains a great deal. Cappadocian tuff is primarily volcanic glass fragments, crystal shards, and rock pieces cemented in a silica-rich matrix, with a porosity, the percentage of its volume made up of tiny interconnected pores, of roughly 20 to 40%. In dry climates, moisture exchange through these pores slowly precipitates minerals into them, reinforcing the cement over time. The tuff self-reinforces as it ages. In wet climates, the same process weakens it. Another reason Cappadocia's aridity was critical to the long-term survival of its underground structures. The compressive strength of the rock ranges from 2 to 15 megapascal, depending on the layer and its moisture content. Concrete typically runs 20 to 40. Tuff is softer, but the builders of Derinkuyu compensated with geometry, vaulted ceilings, round arches, curved passages, shapes that distribute load efficiently and reduce stress at any single point. These were intuitive engineers, reading the rock and building accordingly. One geological footnote that deserves a mention is aragonite. In the 1970s, researchers studying villages in Cappadocia found that mesothelioma, a rare cancer usually associated with asbestos, was responsible for 50% of all deaths. The culprit was aragonite, a zeolite mineral with fibrous structure similar to asbestos, occurring naturally in some local tuffs. Genetic susceptibility plays a significant role. Not everyone exposed developed cancer, but the finding is a reminder that this landscape carries gifts and dangers in equal measure. Chapter 3: Before the Beginning. The human story of Cappadocia is not a story with a clear beginning. It accumulates layer by layer, civilization by civilization, each one building on the bones of whatever came before. The name that the world eventually settled on for this region reaches into the Persian Empire, when the plateau was known as Cappadocia, Old Persian for a land of beautiful horses. The high plateau's dry grasslands and cold winters bred exceptional animals, and Cappadocian horses were famous throughout the ancient world. Herodotus mentioned them. The Romans prized them. The horse breeding tradition here persisted as a regional identity for millennia, long after the Persians who named it has ceased to exist as a political force. But the Persians were relative newcomers. People had been living on this plateau for thousands of years before any Persian administrator set foot here and gave it a name. The Neolithic settlers, 9,000 to 5,500 BCE. The earliest confirmed human settlement in the broader Cappadocian region dates to the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period that begins in this part of the world around 10,000 years ago, when human beings were making the slow, tentative transition from a life organized around hunting and gathering to a life organized around growing food. The site of Hoyuk, located near the foot of Mount Hassan on the southern edge of the Cappadocian Plateau, has been excavated since the 1980s and has yielded evidence of continuous occupation from roughly 8,200 to 7,400 BCE. What was found there speaks to people who were still largely mobile, still dependent on hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants, but who were beginning to cluster in one place long enough to leave a recognizable archaeological imprint: stone tools, animal bones, post holes where wooden structures once stood. How we know what we know about these people is worth explaining, because the method of the Neolithic archaeology are different from those of later periods. There is no writing, there are no monumental structures in most cases. What survives is the small and the accidental, the tools people dropped and did not bother to retrieve, the bones of animals they ate, the ash of their fire. the seeds of the plants they harvested or stored. Radiocarbon dating, measuring the decay of the carbon-14 isotope in organic material, allows archaeologists to assign ages to charcoal, from hearth to animal bone to seeds. The picture that emerges from Asili and other related sites is of a semi-nomadic people who returned to certain locations seasonally, who hunted auroch and wild sheep, and gathered lentils and acorn wheat from the surrounding grasslands, who made tools from obsidian, the sharp volcanic glass abundant in the region thanks to those same volcanoes that produced the tuff, and who were beginning very slowly to modify the environment around them. Not far from Asili, the site of Çatalhöyük, perhaps the most famous Neolithic site in the world, offers a more elaborate picture of what life in central Anatolia looked like as the Neolithic matured. Çatalhöyük, occupied from roughly 7500 to 5700 BCE, was a remarkably dense settlement of mud brick houses packed so tightly together that there were no streets. Residents entered their homes through holes in the roofs. At its height, it may have housed up to 8,000 people, making it arguably one of the largest human settlements on Earth for its time. The walls of its buildings were decorated with elaborate paintings, hunting scenes, geometric patterns, the outlines of animals and human figures. And among these paintings, on a wall dated to approximately 6600 BCE, is an image that has fascinated researchers for decades. What appears to be a plain view of the settlement itself, with 80+ cells representing its tightly packed buildings, and behind it, a large conical shape erupting with what looks like fire and boulders. Many researchers have interpreted this as a depiction of Hasan Dağ volcano in eruption, which would make it the oldest known landscape painting in human history, and evidence that the people of Çatalhöyük had witnessed and recorded a volcanic event. The identification is not universally accepted. Some argue it depicts a leopard skin, but the discussion itself reveals how intimately the human story of this region has always been entangled with its volcanic geology. What Çatalhöyük tells us about its people, beyond its proximity to active volcanoes, is significant. They practiced a form of agriculture. They grew wheat, barley, and lentils, and herded cattle and sheep. But hunting remained important, and the iconography of the site is saturated with wild animals, bulls, leopards, vultures. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses, occasionally exhuming and recirculating skulls, suggesting a complex set of beliefs about ancestors and the relationship between the living and the dead. They traded widely. Obsidian from Mount Hassan, found at Çatalhöyük, was also found at sites across a wide radius, evidence of exchange networks reaching hundreds of kilometers. And they showed, in their dense, aggregated settlement pattern, a willingness to live in close proximity to large numbers of other people that would have required sophisticated social management, rules, hierarchy, ways of resolving disputes, ways of organizing collective efforts. The Neolithic in central Anatolia lasted in various forms until roughly 5500 BCE, when the period archaeologists call the Chalcolithic the Copper Age began. The Chalcolithic and Early Bronze Age, 5500 to 2000 BCE. The Chalcolithic is named for copper, the first metal that human beings learned to smelt and shape deliberately. The discovery, or more accurately, the gradual development over centuries of metallurgy was transformative. Copper tools are harder and more durable than stone tools. They can be resharpened, they can be cast into complex shapes, and the social consequences of metallurgy were as significant as the practical ones. Copper ore does not occur everywhere, which means that access to metal created a new form of wealth, new trade networks, and new hierarchies of power. In central Anatolia during the Chalcolithic, settlements became more complex and more socially stratified. The evidence comes from sites like the Koshkoyak, near the modern city of Nida, in the heart of Cappadocia, which was occupied from roughly 5500 to 4500 BCE. Excavations at Koshkoyak revealed a farming community that produced elaborate painted pottery, distinctive designs in red and cream that marked Cappadocian chalcolic ceramics as a recognizable style, and that showed evidence of long-distance trade, with obsidian tools made from material whose chemical signature has been matched to specific volcanic sources, and shells that could only have come from the Mediterranean coast, hundreds of kilometers away. These people were connected, embedded in networks of exchange that stretch far beyond their immediate region. By the early Bronze Age, beginning around 3000 BCE, Anatolia was a complex landscape of competing chiefdoms in small city-states, each controlling agricultural land and trade routes, each producing distinctive pottery and metalwork that archaeologists used to map their distribution and connections. It was during the early Bronze Age that the region that would become Cappadocia first appears as a node in a long-distance trade network of continental significance, not because of anything like the Cappadocians themselves were doing, but because of what lay beneath the Anatolian plateau to their north and east: silver, gold, tin, and copper, in quantities that the civilizations of Mesopotamia desperately needed. The Assyrian merchant colonies, 2000 to 1750 BCE. Here the story becomes dramatically more specific, because around 2000 BCE, the archaeological record of central Anatolia does something unusual. It becomes literate. Not because the Anatolians themselves had been developing writing, but because a group of Assyrian merchants set up trading colonies in the region and brought their cuneiform tablets with them. The Assyrian merchant colony at Kanesh, modern Kutepe, located roughly 50 kilometers northeast of modern Nevşehir, squarely within the Cappadocian world, is one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Excavated systematically since the 1920s, the site has yielded more than 20,000 cuneiform tablets written in Old Assyrian that constitute the largest archive of Bronze Age commercial correspondence in existence. These are not royal inscriptions or religious texts. They are business records, invoices, contracts, letters, accounts of debts and payments and disputes. They are the paperwork of a trading empire. The picture they paint is vivid. Assyrian merchants of the city of Ashur on the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, organized caravans of donkeys loaded with tin, brought from mines in Afghanistan and Iran, and with high-quality Assyrian textile. They traveled hundreds of kilometers across the mountains and plains of Anatolia to reach Kanesh, where they established a permanent colony called a Karum. From Kanesh, they traded with the local Anatolian rulers, giving tin and textiles in exchange for silver and gold, which they then carried back to Ashur. The system was organized on a sophisticated credit and interest basis, with loans, partnerships, and commercial contracts that would not look out of place in a modern business law textbook. The local Anatolian rulers they dealt with were called the people of Hatti, a name that would persist as the land gradually coalesced into the Hittite Empire. These were not yet the Hittites as history knows them, but they were the immediate predecessors, the indigenous Anatolian chieftains and small kings who controlled the land and the trade routes, who taxed the Assyrian caravans, who gradually absorbed and adapted the cuneiform writing system the merchants brought with them. The Karum period lasted from roughly 1950 to 1750 BCE, when it came to an abrupt end. The tablets stopped, the colony at Kanesh was destroyed, and the Assyrian merchant network collapsed. Whether this was due to political upheaval in Assyria itself, conflict between local Anatolian rulers, or some other cause is not fully established, but the period of Assyrian commercial activity had permanently changed central Anatolia. It had given the region its first literate records, established Kanesh as a major urban center, and laid the economic and social foundations on which the Hittite Empire would be built. The Hittites, 1700 to 1200 BCE. The Hittites emerged as a recognizable imperial power in central Anatolia around 1700 BCE, coalescing from the Hattian population that had hosted the Assyrian merchants. Their capital was Hattusa, carved into a dramatic landscape of rocky hills and ravine north of the Cappadocian Plateau, a site chosen for its defensibility as much as its geography, surrounded on three sides by steep valleys and fortified on the fourth by a massive walls of stone and mud brick that still impress visitors today. What we know about the Hittites comes from several sources. The ruins of Hattusa itself, excavated by German and Turkish archaeologists since 1907. The massive cuneiform archive found there, comprising tens of thousands of tablets in Hittite, Akkadian, Hurrian, and several other languages. Inscriptions on rock faces and monuments throughout Anatolia, and references in the records of their contemporaries, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, with whom they conducted diplomacy and waged war. The Hittites were remarkable for several reasons. They were among the first people to smelt iron, not in great quantities and not as widely distributed technology, but enough to give their warriors a significant advantage in certain engagements, and enough to make iron a prestige commodity that Hittite kings sent as diplomatic gifts to their peers. They developed an early system of international law, including what may be the world's first known peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh, concluded between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II around 1259 BCE. after their armies fought a massive and inconclusive battle at the Syrian city of Kadesh. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides agreed eventually on the treaty, copies of which survives in both Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions and Hittite cuneiform. Cappadocia was not the heart of the Hittite world. That was Hattusa to the north. But it was part of the Hittite sphere of influence, a productive agricultural region controlled by Hittite governors and periodically raided by rival powers. Hittite artifacts found in the Derinkuyu region, including the characteristic button-shaped cylinder seal that Hittite culture used throughout its history, confirm that Hittite administration and commerce extended into this area. Whether those Hittite period inhabitants created the earliest chambers of Derinkuyu or simply used natural occurring caves and hollow formations for storage and occasional refuge is one of the site's persistent open questions. Some archaeologists lean toward the former. Others argue the case is insufficient. The artifacts are there. The proof of construction is not. The Hittite Empire reached its territorial height in the 13th century BCE, controlling a domain that stretched from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates and from the Black Sea to the northern borders of Canaan. It was, by standards of the Bronze Age, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world, a peer of Egypt and Babylon, a state that communicated with its equals in the diplomatic language of Akkadian cuneiform, that maintained archives and law codes and religious calendars of extraordinary complexity. And then around 1200 BCE, it was gone. The Bronze Age collapse, 1200 BCE. The event that historians call the Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most debated and most fascinating catastrophes in the archaeological record. Within the space of perhaps 50 years, which is an eye blink in archaeological time, virtually every major civilization around the Eastern Mediterranean either disappeared entirely or was so severely damaged that it took centuries to recover. The Hittite Empire collapsed and was never rebuilt. The Mycenaean Greek palace culture collapsed. The linear B writing system was lost and forgotten for 3,000 years. The great city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was destroyed and never reoccupied. The Egyptian New Kingdom survived, but was so weakened that it never regained its former power. Dozens of smaller cities and states were destroyed, their populations scattered or killed. The causes are genuinely debated among archaeologists, historians, and climatologists, and the debate has intensified in recent decades as new evidence has emerged. The traditional explanation, invasion by a mysterious confederation of peoples known as the Sea Peoples, referenced in Egyptian inscriptions describing attacks on the Nile Delta, has given way to a more complex, multi-causal understanding. Climate proxy data, including pollen records from lake sediments and isotope analysis from speleothems, stalactites and stalagmites in caves, whose chemistry records past rainfall, suggests a prolonged drought affecting the eastern Mediterranean, beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting for several decades. A severe drought in a complex agricultural civilization that depended on large grain surpluses to feed its palace economy, its armies, and its artisan class would have been devastating. Add to that the disruption of the Bronze Age trade networks on which Hittite iron and Cypriot copper and Egyptian grain all depended, and a cascade failure becomes imaginable. The Sea Peoples may not have been invaders, but refugees, populations displaced by drought and political collapse in their own homelands, moving westward and southward in desperate search of better conditions, adding their pressure to systems already under stress. In Anatolia, the evidence of the collapse is stark. At Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, the end came with fire. The great palace and temples were burned. The storehouses were emptied, either looted or deliberately cleared in advance of abandonment. The population scattered. The last Hittite tablets found in the highest levels of the archive have a quality of urgency. Requests for grain, messages about approaching enemies, administrative records that stop mid-sentence. The civilization that had maintained a literate, administratively sophisticated empire for 5 centuries simply ceased to function within a generation. What followed was a period that archaeologists call, for central Anatolia, a dark age, from roughly 1200 to 900 BCE, during which the population declined, urban life largely disappeared, and the written record vanished entirely. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, knew nothing of the Hittites, their capital, their empire, their archives, their treaties, their gods. All of it had been so completely erased from cultural memory that their very name would not be recovered until German archaeologist Hugo Winkler excavated Hattusa in 1906 and found the cuneiform archive that finally established who had built the place. The Bronze Age collapse is relevant to Derinkuyu in a specific way. It is precisely in this period, after the Hittite administrative presence dissolved, after the sophisticated palace economy that had organized and taxed and policed the Cappadocian plateau collapsed, that the region's population would have been most vulnerable and most in need of whatever protection the earth could offer. The political infrastructure that had once provided a degree of security, the Hittite garrison system, the administrative network, the military apparatus of the empire, was gone. In its place was a power vacuum that would be filled slowly and fitfully over the following centuries by new arrivals from the west. Into that vacuum came the Phrygians. Chapter 4. The Phrygians. The Phrygians deserve more fame than they have. They tend to be overshadowed by their neighbors, the gold-rich Lydians, the war-torn Trojans, the empire-building Hittites. But they were a remarkable people, and understanding them is essential to understanding Derinkuyu, because they are the civilization most likely to have put the first picks to the tough. The Phrygians were Indo-European speakers, their language distantly related to Greek, and the other tongues of the broad Indo-European family that spread across Eurasia during the Bronze and Iron Ages. They appeared to have migrated into Anatolia from Thrace and the Balkans, the European side of what is now the Turkish Strait, during the disruption of the Late Bronze Age collapse, arriving in waves across the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. They moved into the vacuum left by the Hittites, gradually settling the central Anatolian plateau and establishing themselves as the dominant cultural and political force in the region by roughly 900 BCE. Their core territory, the region Greeks later call Phrygia, centered on the upper valleys of the Sangarius River, but their cultural influence radiated outward across the plateau, reaching Cappadocia to the east. The Phrygian language is known from inscriptions. There are around 200 surviving examples, carved in a distinctive alphabet derived from the same Phoenician source that gave the Greeks their letters, and from a handful of Phrygian words preserved in Greek and Roman sources. The inscriptions are often short and formulaic, many of them curses placed on tombs to discourage grave robbers, but they confirm that the Phrygians were literate in a limited sense. They had a writing system and used it for specific ceremonial and commemorative purposes, even if they never developed the elaborate palace archive culture of the Hittites. The Phrygian political structure was a monarchy, a kingdom ruled by a line of kings alternating, apparently by convention, between the names Gordius and Midas. The Gordian knot, that legendary tangle of cornel bark that Alexander the Great famously cut rather than untie, was named for the Phrygian capital Gordian, which Alexander visited in 333 BCE. The historical Midas, several generations of kings bore this name, is the one who maintained correspondence with the Syrian king Sargon II in the late 8th century BCE, making him one of the few Phrygian rulers with a confirmed historical anchor in another civilization's record. The mythological Midas, who turned things to gold and grew donkey ears, is a later Greek elaboration built on the fame of the actual dynasty. The Phrygians were, above almost everything else, builders in stone, and specifically builders who worked directly with the rock face rather than piling stones on top of the ground. Their most distinctive monuments are the so-called Phrygian rock facade, elaborate carved surfaces on natural cliff faces and outcroppings, typically featuring a geometric grid of false windows and niches carved in regular patterns, framed by elaborate geometric borders. These facades are found throughout the Phrygian heartland and into the surrounding regions, and some of them are extraordinary in their scale and intricacy. The Midas Monument, a facade near the city of Eskişehir that may stand 12 meters high, is carved with dense geometric ornament on every surface, is the most celebrated example, and it is the kind of work that makes clear immediately that the Phrygians were not people who hacked at stones clumsily. They had developed over generations a sophisticated understanding of how to read natural rock formations, plan large-scale carvings across their surfaces, and execute the work with a precision that has endured for 28 centuries. The religious context of these monuments is significant. Many of the rock facades were associated with the cult of Cybele, the great mother goddess, the most important deity of the Phrygian pantheon. Cybele was a goddess of caves, of mountains, of the wild places where civilization's edge faded into something older and more primal. Her shrines were naturally and preferentially located in rock, in the natural niches of cliff faces, in caves, in the hollows of mountains. The Phrygian practice of carving elaborate facade into rock was in part a way of creating appropriate sacred spaces for Cybele, transforming natural stone formations into worked religious monuments, marking the boundary between the human world and whatever lay inside the mountains. This religious geography is directly relevant to Derinkuyu, a people whose dominant religious tradition associated caves in the interiors of rock formations with the divine feminine, with the protective mother, with the sheltering earth. This is precisely the people one would expect to carve deep into tough, looking for something more than just storage space. To go underground in the Phrygian religious worldview was to go toward the sacred. The carved chambers in the rock was to make space for something that mattered. The Turkish Department of Culture officially attributes the initial excavation at Derinkuyu to the Phrygians in the 8th or 7th century BCE. This is the most widely accepted scholarly view, though it rests on circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. Tuff cannot be radiometrically dated. No inscription at the site says who made it. But Phrygian period artifacts appear in the region, and the cultural context fits closely. It is strong inference, even if it cannot be called certainty. One of the earliest written references that may describe these underground spaces comes from Xenophon. In 401 BCE, stranded deep in the Persian Empire after the death of the Persian prince his mercenary army had been hired to support, Xenophon led the famous 10,000, a force of roughly 10,000 Greek soldiers, on their epic march home through the Anatolian interior. The Anabasis, written around 370 BCE, is his account of that journey, and it is one of the great adventure narratives of the ancient world. In it, Xenophon mentions almost in passing that certain Anatolian peoples had excavated their homes underground, dwellings large enough to hold a family, their animals, and their food stores. He notes it the way a traveler might note an unusual local custom, not with astonishment, but with the matter-of-fact observation of someone who has seen many strange things. But the description fits Cappadocia precisely. What the Phrygians built in the earliest phase of Derinkuyu was almost certainly modest. A few rooms, perhaps storage chambers, a place to hide animals or grain in times of danger, maybe a small refuge for a family or a small group during raids. The rock was easy, and the advantages were obvious, and so generations would have added more. Another room, another tunnel, another level. The city grew organically across centuries, each expansion reflecting the needs and fears of whoever undertook it, each generation inheriting the work of the last and building upon it. It is worth imagining the physical reality of this work. The tools were iron picks and chisels, wooden mallets, oil lamps, and baskets or leather sacks for the spoil. Each swing of the pick loosens a fragment of rock that must be gathered and carried out through tunnels already carved, back to the surface. For every room created, enormous quantity of material had to be removed, and that material had to go somewhere on the surface. though the specific disposal sites have never been definitively identified. The work was done in lamplight, in enclosed spaces, breathing thickening air, listening to the echoes of picking off stone walls, constantly checking for cracks and weak spots, adjusting when the rock behaved unexpectedly. Slow work, generational work, not built in a year or a decade, but accumulated over perhaps 3,000 years, layer by layer, people by people, crisis by crisis. Chapter 5. From Phrygians to Persians to Christians. The Phrygian kingdom that had built Gordian and carved the plateau did not collapse the way Hittites had, catastrophically, all at once, in fire and silence. It faded. In the 7th century BCE, a new power arrived from the east that disrupted Anatolian stability. The Cimmerians, a nomadic people from the steppe north of the Black Sea, who swept through Anatolia on horseback, sacking Gordian and reportedly killing the Midas of that generation sometime around 695 BCE. The Phrygian state never fully recovered from the Cimmerian raids. It diminished from a regional power into a subordinate entity, eventually absorbed into the rising empire of Lydia to its west. The Lydians centered their capital Sardis on the broad river valleys of western Anatolia, are remembered for two things: their legendary wealth. King Croesus of Lydia may be the origin of the phrase rich as Croesus, and the invention of coinage. Lydian gold and silver coins, the first true minted currency in history, appear in the archaeological record around 600 BCE and represent a fundamental innovation in how economies could be organized. The Lydian Empire absorbed Phrygia, including the Cappadocian fringe of Phrygian territory, and extended its control eastward across Anatolia. But Lydia's moment did not last. In 547 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia defeated Croesus at the Battle of Thymbra and captured Sardis. Lydia became a Persian satrapy almost overnight, and with it, all of Anatolia, including Cappadocia, came under Achaemenid Persian control. The satrap appointed to administer the region governed from a distance, exacting tribute and maintaining order without fundamentally disrupting local life. Cappadocia became the satrapy of Cappadocia, the land of beautiful horses, supplying the Persian army with cavalry and the Persian court with taxes. Persian rule brought the region a degree of stability in connection to the vast Achaemenid road network, the royal road that ran from Sardis to Susa, and that was maintained by royal post stations, allowing messages and armies to move quickly across the empire. It also brought the Zoroastrian religious influence of the Persian court, traces of which sacred fire temples, Zoroastrian influenced funerary practices, have been found in the archaeological record of pre-Roman Cappadocia, though they coexisted with whatever older Phrygian and Anatolian traditions persisted locally. Persian rule ended with astonishing speed when Alexander the Great swept through Anatolia, beginning in 334 BCE. His campaign was not a slow, grinding conquest, but a lightning advance that dismantled the Persian administration, province by province, before the empire could fully mobilize against him. Alexander crossed into Anatolia at the Hellespont in 334 BCE, defeated a Persian force at the Granicus River, and within a year controlled the entire Aegean coast. He cut the Gordian knot in 333 BCE, whether symbolically or literally is debated, and pressed eastward, meeting and defeating Darius III at the Battle of Issus later that year. By 330 BCE, the Achaemenid Persian Empire had ceased to exist as a political entity. Cappadocia technically resisted Alexander's passage. The satrap Ariarathes I refused to submit, and Alexander, in his rush eastward, did not stop to reduce the province by force. Cappadocia remained a semi-independent remnant of Persian influence under Ariarathes, and his successor, the Ariarathed dynasty, for the next century and a half, navigating the complex politics of the post-Alexandrine world without being formally incorporated into any of the successor kingdoms that divided Alexander's empire. This dynasty, ruling from their capital, Mazaka, gradually Hellenized, adopting Greek language, Greek coinage, Greek cultural forms, while maintaining a local character shaped by centuries of Phrygian and Persian influence. It was during this Hellenistic period, roughly 300 to 100 BCE, that the Greek language became dominant in Cappadocia's educated and administrative classes, a shift that would have profound long-term consequences. The Greek-speaking population would eventually constitute the Cappadocian Greeks, who used the underground cities well into the 20th century, traces its linguistic roots to this Hellenistic assimilation. The language of the tunnels, the language of the inscriptions in the underground church, the language of the prayer in the dark. That language became Greek during the Hellenistic period. The Ariarathed dynasty was eventually destabilized by Roman interference in internal succession struggles, and in 17th CE, the Emperor Tiberius annexed Cappadocia directly as a Roman province following the death of King Archelaus, the last Cappadocian king, who had been summoned to Rome and died there under circumstances that the ancient sources describe with varying degrees of suspicion. The annexation was relatively peaceful. Cappadocia was absorbed into the Roman administrative structure. Its capital, Mazaka, renamed Caesarea in honor of the imperial family, and the province settled into its role as a productive but remote part of the Roman world, supplying horses, wool, and agricultural surplus to the broader imperial economy. Under Rome, and in the centuries following the empire's adoption of Christianity, the underground cities took on new significance. The early Christian era was, for the people of Cappadocia, a time of both spiritual transformation and persistent fear. Roman persecution of Christians was neither constant nor universal. Its intensity varied enormously by region and by emperor. But in certain periods, it was severe, and the cultural memory of persecution shaped the community's relationship to its underground city, even during calmer intervals. By the time the Byzantine Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, and the faith became the official religion of the empire, under Theodosius in 380 CE. The Cappadocian Christian community was already well established, deeply rooted, and possessed of a long tradition of concealment in underground survival. The region had produced some of the most significant theologians of the early church. The Cappadocian fathers, Basil the Great, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus, were 4th century figures whose work on the doctrine of the Trinity shaped Orthodox Christian theology in ways that persist today. Basil alone established what is considered the prototype of the hospital outside the walls of Caesarea and wrote the monastic rules still governing Orthodox monasteries. Their existence is testimony to the intellectual vitality of Christian Cappadocia, a community that was not just hiding, but thinking, writing, arguing, and building institutions that would outlast them by millennia. The Greek-speaking Christian population that expanded Derinkuyu in this period carved chapels with arched niches for icons, set aside rooms for teaching, added Greek inscriptions, and crosses in the Cairo monogram to the walls. The city was becoming something more than a refuge. It was becoming a community in the fullest sense, with the social, spiritual, and educational architecture, and they understood they might need it not just for days, but for weeks or months, hidden from whatever was passing above. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Survival. Let us descend into Derinkuyu itself. Walk through it slowly. The modern entrance is beneath the unremarkable streets of the town. You step down a stone staircase, and immediately the temperature drops. That steady 13 to 15 degrees the tuff maintains regardless of season. The walls are pale cream and golden brown, marked with the regular scars of ancient picks. The ceiling curves above in a gentle arch. The passages are narrow enough for a single file, narrow enough in some stretches to require ducking. This narrowness was deliberate. An army is wide. Soldiers fight in formations. But in a tunnel wide enough for one person, an army becomes a single file line of isolated individuals, unable to form up, unable to fight as a unit, advancing blind into a labyrinth that might dead end without warning, or drop into a pit, or be sealed by a door they cannot open. Those doors are among Derinkuyu's most celebrated features, and among its most extraordinary. Great circular stones, shaped like millstones, between 1 and 2 meters in diameter, weighing roughly 500 kilometers. They were rolled across tunnel entrances from the inside, using stone rollers and pivot points, and once in place, could not be removed from outside. No external handle, no external mechanism of any kind. To move them, you needed a bar inserted through a small hole in the center. From the interior, an attacker facing one of these doors was simply stopped, and through that same central hole, a defender could thrust a spear. Each level of the city had its own door. Each level could be sealed independently. If the upper sections were breached, the lower levels remained secure. This was not a single defensible space, but a series of nested defensive layers, each independent of the ones above. The layout reflects the philosophy throughout. On the first level, just below the surface, stables. The placement was deliberate. Livestock produce methane and carbon dioxide in quantity, and by keeping animals on the uppermost level, their waste gases could be vented more easily, the heavier gases sinking to stable floors rather than drifting down into inhabited space. The stone tethering rings are still visible in the walls. The carved troughs where the animals fed and drank remain in place. The second level contains a large room with a barrel-vaulted ceiling, the space archaeologists call the missionary school. The barrel vault, a half-cylinder arch extending along the room's length, is both structurally efficient and architecturally ambitious. Small rooms opening off to the sides served as study spaces or classrooms. This was a room designed for assembly and teaching, maintained underground to preserve the faith when the surface was hostile. The ventilation system is perhaps the most impressive engineering achievement in the entire city. Over 50 shafts of varying diameters penetrate the rock from the surface down to various levels. These are not simple holes. They are engineered passageways, angled and sized to create passive convective flow. Warm air, being less dense, rises. Cooler air sinks. By connecting underground spaces to the surface at calculated positions, the builders established ventilation without any mechanical assistance. Air flowing constantly through the city, driven by convection and wind. Even at the deepest levels, 85 meters down, the air remained breathable. Most underground spaces of comparable depth, without mechanical ventilation, accumulate dangerous levels of carbon dioxide within hours. That Derinkuyu could sustain 20,000 people and their animals is not a minor achievement. The largest ventilation shaft doubled as a well, approximately 55 meters deep, connecting to the water table. This was critical. A siege works by cutting off food and water. A sealed underground space with its own water supply, water that cannot be poisoned or cut off from outside, transforms a siege from a military operation into a game of patience. The builders designed the wells so it could be isolated from the upper levels during attack, preventing an enemy who had penetrated the entrance from contaminating the supply for people below. This is systematic, strategic thinking. Specialized spaces reflect the need of a community intending to remain for extended periods. Wine presses, stone platforms with carved channels for the juice to flow through, because wine was both drink and water preservative. Oil presses for cooking and lamp fuel, large storage chambers where grains kept for months, communal kitchens with carved stone hearths, their ceilings still blackened by millennia of cooking smoke. Small family sleeping rooms, little larger than modern closets, where families huddled together and waited. On the fifth level, a church, cruciform in plan, a cross-shaped floor carved into the rock, with nave and transept in the form Byzantine Christian architecture favored. A cruciform plan requires precise geometric understanding and significant labor to execute in solid stone. The builders knew what they were making. Niches in the walls held icons. A baptistery space survives. This is not a panicked hiding place. It was a maintained religious life, conducted underground and invisible by a community that refused to let fear erode everything they were. This is also, on the deeper levels, a space interpreted as a dungeon, a confined, secure room separated from the rest of the city by narrow passages. Who was held there, under what circumstances, is not known with certainty. It is a reminder that the underground city was not a sanctuary in the idealized sense. It was a community, with all the complexity and power that communities carry. One unglamorous but vital detail: waste management. The inhabitants used seal clay jars as latrines, containing biological material and pathogens effectively, preventing the spread of disease that might otherwise have devastated thousands living in close quarters. The dead were managed in designated spaces with chemical compounds, likely lime, to accelerate decomposition and contain odors. These practical systems reflect a genuine, empirically developed public health awareness that kept the city livable across its centuries of use. Chapter 7: The Great Expansion. The city that the Phrygians began and the early Christians expanded reached its fullest expression during the Byzantine era, driven by one of the most sustained military conflicts the region had ever faced. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's eastern successor, centered on Constantinople, Greek in language and Orthodox in religion, controlled Cappadocia from the 4th century CE onward. For several centuries, the region was a stable frontier province. Then, beginning in the 7th century, everything changed. The rise of Islam, the extraordinary military campaigns of the early caliphate, and the Arab conquests that followed Muhammad's death in 632 CE reshaped the entire eastern Mediterranean within a single generation. The Levant fell, Mesopotamia fell, Egypt fell in 642, and through the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, Arab armies struck repeatedly into Anatolia, into the Cappadocian heartland itself. The Arab-Byzantine Wars, lasting from roughly 634 to 1180 CE in their broadest sense, were not a single conflict, but a sustained cycle of raids, invasions, counterattacks, and recaptures. Arab forces swept north through the Taurus Mountains into Anatolia, raiding for slaves and plunder, sometimes holding territory before being pushed back. Byzantine armies counterattacked southward. The frontier shifted constantly. The people of Cappadocia lived in generational insecurity. The archaeological evidence, Byzantine period artifacts from roughly the 5th to 10th century CE, shows Derinkuyu in active and intensive use through these centuries. The chapels were carved during this period, the Greek inscriptions were added, the lower levels were deepened, the wine and oil presses were installed. The city was being systematically upgraded as a long-term shelter for a large population. Imagine a summer afternoon in the 8th century. Word arrives. Arab riders spotted south of the Taurus passes. The community moves. Men, women, children, the elderly, infants. Livestock herded into the stables. Grain carried down. Water jars filled. Lamps lit. The stone doors rolled into positions, one by one sealing the city from above. And then, Not silence because 20,000 people are not silent. Cattle breathing, children crying, prayers from the church on the 5th level, and perhaps, very faintly, muffled by meters of stone, the sound of hoofbeats on the surface. They wait for days, weeks sometimes. They have water from the well, grain, wine, each other, their faith. Eventually, the sounds above cease. Scouts slip out through concealed entrances, more than 600 of them, scattered across a wide area, many disguised as natural rock openings or well shafts, and return with news. The raiders have gone. The doors open. The people emerge into sunlight. As far as the historical record shows, Derinkuyu was never successfully breached. Its inhabitants were never discovered underground. The city did what it was designed to do, again and again, across hundreds of years and dozens of threats. It is also in the Byzantine period that we first have clear evidence of the tunnel connecting Derinkuyu to Kaymakli, 9 kilometers to the north. Kaymakli is another enormous underground complex, the widest of the Cappadocian underground cities, notable for its lateral spread, and the tunnel between the two, estimated at 8 to 9 kilometers, suggests a degree of coordination between communities that is striking. 2 cities connected beneath the ground, refugees moving between them through the rocks, resources shared, an entire subterranean civilization, invisible to anyone on the surface. And they were not alone. Archaeologists have identified more than 200 underground complexes of at least 2 levels in the Cappadocia region, with roughly 40 consisting of 3 or more. Some may have been connected by tunnels. The full extent of the network has never been mapped. Less than half of Derinkuyu itself has been fully excavated. The picture emerging is of a regional underground infrastructure, built and used over thousands of years on a scale that still has not been fully reckoned with. Chapter 8. The Mongols, the Ottomans, in the long centuries. The Arab threat diminished as Byzantium stabilized its frontiers through the 9th and 10th centuries. But respite was brief. The 11th century brought the Seljuk Turks, who delivered a catastrophic defeat to the Byzantine army at Manzikert in 1071, and began the gradual Islamization of Anatolia. Cappadocia fell under Seljuk, and then Ottoman influence over the following centuries, while its Christian Greek-speaking population remained, carving new churches, maintaining monasteries, continuing to use the underground cities when danger came. The 14th century brought Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror whose campaigns were marked by systematic violence that horrified even medieval observers. His army swept into Anatolia in the early 15th century, leaving devastated cities in their wake. Historical sources from the period, including one remarkable account describing a captain being killed by a spear thrust through the central hole of a stone door, confirm that Derinkuyu was actively used during this period. The defenders were once again invisible. Under the Ottoman Empire, which consolidated Anatolia through the 15th and 16th centuries, the Christian population of Cappadocia occupied an ambiguous position. The millet system allowed Christian communities to maintain their own institutions, but tolerance was not equality. The relationship between the Muslim Ottoman state and its Christian subjects was fraught with tensions that periodically broke into persecution, violence, and forced conversion. The underground cities continued to serve as refuge during acute crises well into the Ottoman centuries. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the position of Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire was becoming desperate. The Armenian Genocide of 1915 through 1923, the Greek-Turkish Wars of 1919 to 1922, and the broader collapse of the empire created extreme danger for Christian populations throughout Anatolia. In Cappadocia, Armenians and Cappadocian Greeks retreated one final time into the underground cities in the early 20th century to escape persecution. The end of Derinkuyu's inhabited history came in 1923. The Treaty of Lausanne formalized a population exchange between Greece and Turkey, one of the most extensive forced relocations in modern history. Approximately 1.2 million Orthodox Christians were expelled from Anatolia to Greece. Roughly 500,000 Muslims moved in the opposite direction. In Cappadocia, villages that had been Greek-speaking for millennia were emptied within months. The Cappadocian Greeks, carrying what they could, leaving behind their homes, their churches, their ancestors' graves, were taken to the port of Mersin, where ships waited to carry them to a Greece that many had never seen, whose vernacular Greek was so different from their Cappadocian dialect that they might not even be understood. They took with them the knowledge of what lay below. The Turkish inhabitants who arrived in Derinkuyu after 1923, Muslims relocated from Greece, people who had no knowledge of the underground city, built their lives above it. For 40 years, the city waited in the dark, perfectly preserved in the stable, dry interior of the tuff. Chapter 9. The Rediscovery. In 1963, a man swung a sledgehammer. The story circulates in several versions. The most common, a man renovating his basement knocked through a wall and found a tunnel. An alternative, which circulates in local tradition, is more charming. He kept losing his chickens. They disappeared through a crevice in the floor, never returning. Eventually, he enlarged the opening and followed them in. Neither version gives a name. The anonymous discoverer of one of the great archaeological finds of the 20th century remains unknown. Formal investigation followed. The scale emerged gradually, not all at once, but as explorers moved deeper and mapped what they found. 18 levels, 85 meters deep, hundreds of rooms, miles of tunnels. The stone doors still in position. The wine presses still recognizable. The church still showing traces of plaster where the fresco had once been painted. 45 years after its last inhabitants had been forced to leave, Derinkuyu was intact. The site was partially opened to the public in 1965, with wider access established in 1969. Today, approximately half of the known city is accessible. The other half remains either unexcavated or inaccessible for structural reasons. The 8 open levels are carefully managed, lit with discrete electrical installations, pathways marked, fragile areas protected. In 1985, Derinkuyu was included in the UNESCO World Heritage designation granted to Gureme National Park in the rock sites of Cappadocia, recognizing the fairy chimneys, the frescoed rock-cut churches of Gureme, the cave monasteries of the Alara Valley, and the underground cities together as an expression of one of the most unusual environments human beings have ever inhabited. In 2013, construction work in the city of Nev Shahir, not far from Derinkuyu, uncovered the entrance to another underground city that had not been previously known. Early surveys suggested it might be even larger than Derinkuyu, potentially by a third. Excavations are ongoing. The underground history of Cappadocia has not finished revealing itself. Chapter 10. The name and what it means. Derin, deep. Kuyu, well. Derinkuyu means simply deep well. The name derives from the most visible above-ground evidence of the underground city, the ventilation shafts that the local population used for water, not knowing or having forgotten that they were drawing from the wells of an entire buried civilization. The townspeople of Derinkuyu drew their water from those shafts for decades, perhaps centuries, without knowing what lay underneath, without feeling the vast hollow network spreading through the rock underfoot. The Greek name for the place, Malakopia, possibly meaning soft place, a reference to the pliable tuff, was carried away in 1923 by the people who were expelled. The Turkish name remained. Both names are incomplete, as all names are. Neither captures what Derinkuyu actually is, a city that survived everything, that outlasted every civilization that used it, that held its shape through Bronze Age collapses, Arab wars, Mongol invasions, Ottoman centuries, and a final forced diaspora that waited, patient as stone, for someone to knock through a wall. Chapter 11. Kaymakli and the network beneath Cappadocia. Derinkuyu was never alone. It was part of something larger. Kaymakli, 9 kilometers to the north, is the second most visited underground city in the region, and a fascinating complement to Derinkuyu. Where Derinkuyu is defined by depth, 18 levels, 85 meters, Kaymakli is defined by width. Its 4 publicly accessible levels spread laterally through the rock in a broader horizontal pattern, covering more floor area per level. Historically known by its Greek name, Anegup. Its origins trace to the same Phrygian period, and its peak use to the same Byzantine era. The tunnel connecting them, 8 to 9 kilometers of hand-carved passageway, is one of the most striking engineering achievements of the ancient world. Consider the surveying challenge alone. 2 groups of workers, beginning at different ends, must meet in the middle without GPS, without theodolites, without precision instruments of any kind. They had picks, oil lamps, plumb bobs, and accumulated wisdom. The tunnel, still mostly intact for more than 1,000 years, is testament to the depth of that knowledge. The tunnel meant that people could travel between cities without appearing on the surface, invisible to any occupying force, able to share resources, support each other, move refugees if one location was compromised. It was, in effect, a single extended defensive network across 9 kilometers of plateau. Of the 200 plus underground complexes identified in Cappadocia, most are small, single rooms, short corridors, modest family shelter. Around 40 consists of 3 or more levels. Kaymakli is notable for its holes in its tunnel ceilings, through which boiling oil or water could be poured on intruders. Mazi, near Yakup, is another substantial complex. Each has its own character, its own relationship to the land. The full extent of the network is still unknown. New entrances continue to be discovered by construction workers, by archaeologists, by homeowners who knock on a wall and find something on the other side. What lies beneath Cappadocia? Nobody knows entirely, but the more that is found, the more it seems that the underground is not a footnote to the region's history, but half of it. Chapter 12: Daily Life Underground. We have walked through the architecture and traced the history. Now imagine the experience, the actual lived reality of being among the thousands who sheltered there. You are a farmer, Cappadocian Greek, living above the underground city. You farm wheat or grapes or olives, keep cattle and goats. Your family has lived here for generations. You have known about the underground city since childhood, may have explored its upper levels on hot summer afternoons when the cool of the tunnel was a relief. Then one morning, a rider comes. Arab forces south of the passes, moving north, days away. The preparations are practiced. This is a community that has done this before. The grains in the lower chambers is checked, the water assessed. Cattle are herded towards the concealed entrances and driven into the stables. Stone doors are prepared, but not yet closed. When the threat approaches, everyone goes down. The doors are rolled into position. The city is sealed. Now you are in the dark. Not complete dark. Oil lamps provide light, and some shafts let in faint indirect illuminations during the day. But it is dim, flame-lit rather than sunlit, warm and orange and flickering, casting moving shadows on carved walls. The temperature is steady and cool, the same whether summer or winter, morning or night. Every sound echoes, voices, footsteps, the lowering of cattle drifting down through the ventilation shafts, and the smells. Thousands of people, their animals, their cooking, their waste, all of it enclosed in stone. Oil lamps add an acrid note beneath the heavier human smell. The wine press, when in use, sweetens the air briefly. The grain stores have their own dusty, earthy presence. In the church, incense burning during the liturgy offers temporary relief. You sleep on stone or on whatever bedding you manage to bring down. You eat from communal stores, distributed according to whatever system the community has worked out over generations. You drink from the well. You pray in the church, the familiar Greek liturgy echoing off carved rock. Your children grow restless and frightened. They explore the passages, listen to elders, help with small tasks. You do not know how long you will be here. The stone doors insulate you almost entirely from the surface sounds. You might hear very faintly the muffled echoes of hoofbeats or distant voices, but you cannot know what they mean. You wait. You sleep in lamplight. You wake. Another day. Eventually, silence above. Scouts slip out through concealed entrances, observe, and return. The riders have gone, and the doors open. You emerge into daylight. The air is warm and smells of dust and grass. The sun is overwhelming after days of flame. You stand in the street and breathe and look at the familiar landscape, the pale hills, the stone towers, the distant mountains, and feel something that might be gratitude. You have survived again. Chapter 13. The Science of the Underground. 3 problems face anyone who lives underground: temperature, air, and water. Derinkuyu's builders solved all 3. Cappadocian tuff is an extraordinarily effective thermal insulator. On the surface above Derinkuyu, temperatures swing from over 35 degrees Celsius in summer to well below freezing in winter. A few meters below ground, those swings disappear entirely. At depth, the rock stabilizes at the region's mean annual temperature, 13 to 15 degrees Celsius, constant, year-round, day and night. For food storage, this is ideal. Grain, wine, oil, preserved meat, and hard cheese all keep for months in a cool, stable environment. For the inhabitants, it was cool enough to require clothing, but far more survivable than either extremes above. Air quality is more complex. Carbon dioxide, the primary product of respiration, is heavier than air and accumulates in low-lying enclosed spaces. In a sealed underground room without ventilation, CO2 levels can reach dangerous concentrations within hours. The 50-plus ventilation shafts of Derinkuyu are the city's answer. Warm air from the inhabited spaces rises through the shafts, drawing cooler, fresh air in through other openings. Passive convection requiring no machinery, no fuel, no maintenance. Even at the deepest levels, this system maintained oxygen concentrations well above the 18% threshold at which humans' cognition begins to deteriorate. The smoke from thousands of oil lamps and cooking fires was handled by the same airflow. The blackened ceilings visible today in the kitchen areas are evidence of where the system was least efficient, near concentrated heat sources. The well at 55 meters connects to a water table in the tuff, which acts as an effective aquifer, the porous rock filtering groundwater clean as it moves through it. The design feature that isolated the well from the upper levels during a siege was critical. An enemy who managed to access the entrance could not contaminate the water supply for people below. The city was, in this specific sense, genuinely siege-proof. The olive oil lamp burning throughout the city produced relatively clean combustion compared to animal fats or pine resin, but thousands of them in an enclosed space still generated significant smoke. The ventilation system handled it reasonably. Cooking fires, being larger and more concentrated, produced the permanent staining still visible on kitchen ceilings today. The inhabitants managed because the alternative, being found by whatever was on the surface, was worse. Chapter 14. The Archaeology, How We Know What We Know. It is worth pausing to consider what archaeology can and cannot tell us about Derinkuyu, because the limits of our knowledge are as interesting as the knowledge itself. The primary challenge is chronological. Dating underground rock-cut structures is genuinely difficult. Unlike sites where material can be radiometrically analyzed, wood for dendrochronology, charcoal for carbon dating, fired pottery for thermoluminescence, tough walls leave no datable signature from the act of cutting. What archaeologists can date are the artifacts found within the city, and architectural features that can be stylistically compared to dated examples elsewhere. Byzantine-era inscriptions and artifacts provide a terminus antiquum for the spaces in which they were deposited, but say nothing definitive about when those spaces were originally carved. The result is that Derinkuyu's chronology rests on a combination of indirect evidence, stylistic analysis, and contextual archaeology. The Phrygian attribution is strong, but circumstantial. It is not proven in the strictest historical sense. This uncertainty is not unusual. Many of the most significant ancient monuments resist confident attribution. Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, the megalithic tombs of Western Europe. The uncertainty does not make them less interesting. It forces careful thinking about what evidence means and how much can be legitimately inferred from incomplete data. Physical analysis of the city itself has been more productive. The regular pick patterns on the walls suggest organized, systematic excavation, planned work following the structural logic of the rock. The consistency of the ventilation system across levels suggests either a single design intelligence or a strong transmitted tradition of design knowledge. The use of vaulted ceilings and curved passages throughout speaks to an intuitive structural understanding refined over generations. Newer methods are beginning to contribute. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive geophysical techniques can detect voids in the rock, empty spaces that might be rooms or tunnels without excavation. The 2013 Nev Shahir discovery was partly the product of this kind of surveying combined with accidental surface disturbance. Photogrammetry, producing precise 3D models from photographs, allows researchers to record accessible portions in detail and monitor structural changes over time by comparing models taken years apart. The study of underground microbial communities is an emerging field that may yet yield biological traces of the human population that used these spaces. This is preliminary science, but it represents a new avenue for understanding what happened here. The work continues. Derinkuyu is not a solved problem. It is a site still being understood, still yielding information, with more than half of it still waiting underground. Chapter 15, Derinkuyu in Global Context. To appreciate just how singular Derinkuyu is, it helps to place it among the other underground constructions human beings have made. The most direct comparisons are the other Cappadocian underground cities, Kaymakli, Mazi, Ozkanak, which share the same geology and cultural traditions. But comparable impulses have arisen elsewhere. In the lowest plateau of northwestern China, Yaodong, cave dwellings carved into soft loessic cliffs date back thousands of years and are still in use today, with an estimated 30 to 40 million current inhabitants. Loess shares with Cappadocian tuff the property of being soft enough to cut easily while stable in dry conditions. The underlying logic use the Earth's property to create thermally stable, defensible living space, is identical, though the scale and depth of Yaodong do not approach Derinkuyu's. In Scotland, Germany, and Austria, archaeologists have found Erdstall, narrow medieval tunnels too small for habitation whose purpose is debated, emergency hiding places, spiritual retreats, storage spaces, small in scale, modest in ambition, but products of the same underground impulse. In Jordan, the Nabatean city of Petra represents rock-cut architecture in cliff faces rather than underground excavation, but the same recognition of geological opportunity, soft sandstone, easily carved, remarkably durable, shapes everything about it. The Nabateans, like the Cappadocians, made the rock into their building material by carving into it rather than constructing on top of it. None of these parallels match Derinkuyu's combination of depth, complexity, and duration of use. 85 meters, 18 levels, a complete social infrastructure, schools, churches, wine presses, stables, a ventilation system, a sealed water supply, defensive mechanisms nested level by level, and centuries of active occupation. No other underground complex in archaeological record brings all of these together. There is a growing body of serious engineering work for deep space habitation, for post-catastrophe survival infrastructure, that cites Derinkuyu explicitly as proof of concept for underground living. The engineering challenges of underground habitation, ventilation, water, thermal management, food storage were solved here with iron tools and accumulated empirical knowledge. That this is possible and that it was sustained across thousands of years is not merely a historical curiosity, it is data. Chapter 16, Cappadocian Greek, the language that was lost. One of the most poignant threads in the Derinkuyu story is linguistics. The people who last inhabited the underground city spoke a language that is itself now nearly gone. Cappadocian Greek, developed in isolation on the Anatolian plateau over roughly 2,000 years. Greek arrived with the Hellenization following Alexander's conquest and established itself as the language of the region's Christian population during the Roman period. But unlike Greek elsewhere in the Mediterranean, it was landlocked, surrounded by Turkish and other Anatolian tongues, cut off from the Greek-speaking heartlands, and it evolved accordingly. Over the centuries, Cappadocian Greek absorbed enormous quantities of Turkish vocabulary and grammatical structure. Turkish suffixes entered verb conjugation. Turkish words filled semantic domains. The sound system shifted toward Turkish phonological patterns. The language that emerged was recognizably Greek at its core, but so deeply influenced by Turkish that speakers of standard modern Greek might find it only partially intelligible. A linguist, encountering it for the first time, would immediately notice the traces of centuries of intimate contact between two unrelated language families, each leaving marks on the other. When the Cappadocian Greeks arrived in Greece in 1923, they brought this language with them, but surrounded by standard modern Greek, their children adapted. Within 1 or 2 generations, the ancestral dialect was largely abandoned as a practical matter of integration. It was not preserved deliberately, it was not taught, and it faded. Today, the number of remaining speakers is estimated at a few hundred, all elderly. Linguists have been working intensively to document what remains, recording conversations, building vocabulary lists, analyzing grammatical structures before the last speakers die. It is a race that is nearly lost. The word Malakopia, the Greek name for Derinkuyu, the soft place, is Cappadocian Greek word. It was carried away in 1923. When the last speaker of Cappadocian Greek dies, a linguistic tradition stretching back 2,000 years, encompassing the prayers spoken in the underground church, the conversations in the missionary school, the words exchanged by families in the dark behind their stone doors, will be gone. What will remain is the rock. The tuff holds the shape of what was said here long after the language itself has ceased. Chapter 17. Mysteries and Open Questions. Not everything about Derinkuyu is known, even after 60 years of study. The most fundamental question is also the most difficult. Who built it, and when? The Phrygian attribution is the most widely accepted, but it rests on indirect evidence, cultural context, regional artifacts, stylistic comparison with Phrygian rock-cutting traditions elsewhere. There is no inscriptions, no datable organic material from the earliest excavations. The Hittite artifacts found in the region suggest Hittite presence, but presence does not prove construction. The truth is likely layered. Different parts of the city built at different times by different peoples, each generation expanding and adapting what they found, until the accumulated labor of perhaps 3 millennia produced the city that exists today. The tunnel between Derinkuyu and Kaymakli has not been fully explored. Sections have collapsed, and traversing it is not currently possible. The question of how many other connecting tunnels exist, linking other underground cities, remains open. More than half of Derinkuyu itself has not been fully excavated. What lies below the 8th accessible level? Are there more rooms, more chambers, more passageways deeper in the rock? The structural challenge of excavating those levels, ensuring the stability of what is above, managing groundwater at greater depths, removing spoil through already narrow passages, means progress is slow, but it continues, and each year brings new findings. Derinkuyu has been studied for 6 decades and still has the capacity to surprise. That perhaps is the most honest summary of its status, a site whose full story has not been told and may not be for a long time yet. There is a whole other conversation about Derinkuyu, running parallel to the official one. It unfolds in alternative history books, late-night podcasts, in the hushed tones of people who have stood in those tunnels and felt that the conventional explanation, frightened communities digging with picks to hide from armies, does not quite account for the enormity of what they were standing inside. These theories range from the cautiously heterodox to the spectacularly wild, and they deserve to be laid out as completely as anything else. The rock does not endorse any single interpretation. It keeps its own counsel. The question of age. Could Derinkuyu be much older? The official dating places Derinkuyu's origin in the Phrygian period, the 8th or 7th century BCE. But how do we actually know? As we have discussed, volcanic tuff cannot be radiometrically dated. Carbon dating requires organic material, And the act of cutting stones leaves no datable signature in the stone itself. What we have are Phrygian artifacts found in and around the site, in the cultural context of Phrygian rock cutting traditions. These are strong circumstantial indicators, but they are not the same as proof. This gap between what is known and what can be definitively established is where alternative dating enters. The most compelling of these arguments connects to the Younger Dryas, a geological event that some researchers believe may have shaped not just the climate, but human civilization itself. The Younger Dryas and the cosmic catastrophe hypothesis. 12,800 years ago, the Earth entered a sudden and severe climatic disruption. Over perhaps a few decades, extremely rapid by geological standards, global temperatures plummeted. The North Atlantic cooled by an estimated 10 degrees Celsius. Glacial conditions returned to regions that had been warming. Megafauna extinctions accelerated. The archaeological record across multiple continents shows evidence of population disruption and, in some regions, near collapse. The mainstream scientific explanation attributes this to a massive pulse of melted water from the disintegrating Laurentide ice sheet pouring into the North Atlantic, disrupting the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. The oceanic conveyor belt that carries warm tropical water north and keep the North Atlantic habitable. This is well supported, grounded in ocean sediment cores, ice cores, and paleoclimate modeling. Since 2007, however, a second, more dramatic hypothesis has been accumulating scientific supporters. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that the cooling was triggered or significantly worsened by the fragmentation and impact of a large comet, possibly a body within what is now called the Taurid meteor stream, whose fragments struck multiple regions of Earth around 12,800 years ago. The original proposal, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Richard Firestone, Alan West, James Kennett, and colleagues, cited a platinum-enriched sediment layer, a geochemical signature associated with extraterrestrial materials found at stratigraphic levels corresponding to 12,800 years ago at multiple sites on multiple continents. The layer also contained nanodiamonds, which can be produced by high temperature, high pressure impact events, spherules of melted rock and iron, and widespread wildfire evidence in the form of soot and charcoal. The hypothesis has been neither confirmed nor definitively refuted. A 2018 study in the Journal of Geology reported a platinum spike at 26 sites across multiple continents, all at the same stratigraphic horizon. The separate team reported finding impact markers at Göbekli Tepe itself at the corresponding date. Skeptical researchers argue the markers are inconsistent across sites, could be explained by volcanism or ordinary micrometeorite infall, and that the statistical case for a synchronous global event remains contested. As of 2026, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a genuine scientific controversy, not fringe pseudoscience, published in peer-reviewed journals with serious scientific proponents, but not the consensus view either. The question of what happened 12,800 years ago remains, in an important sense, open. This matters for Derinkuyu because it forms the foundation for one of the most compelling alternative narrative about the site. If a comet struck the Earth 12,800 years ago, triggering fires, an impact winter, and a 1,000-year climatic disruption. The people living through that catastrophe would have had powerful reasons to seek underground shelter, not from armies, but from the sky itself, from impact-driven wildfires, from the sudden darkening of the sun, from the collapse of the food sources and climate stability that surface life depended on. If survivors were present in the Cappadocian region, which was inhabited by anatomically modern humans by at least 12,000 years ago, the soft tuff of the plateau would have presented the same invitation it has always presented, and perhaps what those survivors created was the earliest, deepest, most basic level of what would eventually become Derinkuyu, not the city with its churches and wine presses, but a simpler, older set of chambers, carved not by Phrygian craftsmen, but by desperate people following instinct and opportunity. No artifact evidence currently supports this claim, but more than half of Derinkuyu remains unexcavated. The deepest levels are inaccessible. No systematic effort has been made to look for pre-Phrygian material in those unexplored sections. What is at the bottom of the complex has not yet been examined. Göbekli Tepe, the nearby complication. The Younger Dryas conversation is inseparable from Göbekli Tepe, the extraordinary megalithic site in southeastern Turkey, roughly 700 kilometers from Derinkuyu, that has been reshaping our understanding of prehistoric human capability since its systematic excavation began under Klaus Schmidt in 1995. Göbekli Tepe was built approximately 11,600 years ago, just after the end of the Younger Dryas. Its circular enclosures of T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, are covered in elaborate carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and human-like figures. The people who built it were, by the conventional understanding of their period, hunter-gatherers. Not farmers, no settled communities, no surplus food economy, yet they organized and fed a large workforce capable of quarrying, transporting, and erecting multi-ton stone pillars with carved decorations of striking skill. Before Göbekli Tepe, the standard developmental model held that religious monuments came after agriculture, that you needed surplus in settled communities before you could support monumental construction. Göbekli Tepe inverted this. Schmidt himself proposed that the religious site was the driver of social organization, that the need to feed the workers may have pushed toward the cultivation of wild grasses, and that agriculture may have followed monumentality rather than the other way around. Layered onto this, in 2017, researchers Martin Sweatman and Demetrio Dekresis published a paper arguing that the carvings at Göbekli Tepe encoded astronomical information, specifically that the vulture stone symbols represented constellations and recorded a cosmic impact event around 10,950 BCE, consistent with the Younger Dryas date. Published in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeology, the paper generated substantial controversy. Some researchers found the statistical methods persuasive. Others argued the astronomical identifications were speculative. The debate is ongoing. What is not contested is that Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, the enclosures intentionally backfilled with rubble at some point in the pre-pottery Neolithic, the site then abandoned. Why a sacred place of such obvious importance would be deliberately entombed remains one of the great open questions of Near Eastern archaeology. Some argue ritual decommissioning. Others ask whether the burial might have been preservational, whether the builders were hiding something they wanted to survive, whatever they feared was coming. Derinkuyu and Göbekli Tepe both lie in Anatolia. Both belong to the same broad landscape of ancient human civilization. Whether there is a direct connection between the people who built Göbekli Tepe and those who first excavated Derinkuyu is not known, but the temporal proximity, Göbekli Tepe at 11,600 years ago, Derinkuyu's conventional dating beginning perhaps 3,000 years ago, with the possibility of undated earlier excavations in between, and the geographical relationship invite reflection. The Anunnaki in the pre-flood world. One of the most widely discussed frameworks in alternative history for understanding ancient underground construction involves the Anunnaki, and to understand how this theory applies to Derinkuyu, you first have to understand the mythology itself in full, because it is a genuinely elaborate cosmological story. The Anunnaki are the great gods of the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian religious traditions, the most powerful divine beings in the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia. The civilization that developed in the river valleys of modern Iraq beginning around 5000 BCE. In the original ancient texts, the Anunnaki are the children of the sky god Anu and the earth goddess Ki, the higher divine beings who govern the great cosmic forces, agriculture, flood, war, love, death, and who interact with humanity in ways that range from benevolent to catastrophically destructive. They appear throughout the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian religious corpus, in hymns, in myths, in the great epic of Gilgamesh, in the Atrahasis epic that describes the creation of humans in the flood. The modern reinterpretation of the Anunnaki was primarily the work of Zecharia Sitchin, a Soviet-born journalist and author, whose series of books, beginning with The 12th Planet in 1976, proposed a radical alternative reading of the Sumerian texts, poorly translated, did not describe mythological beings but extraterrestrial visitors, beings from a planet he called Nibiru, which he identified as a large body on a highly elliptical orbit around the Sun, passing through the inner solar system approximately every 3,600 years. The Anunnaki in Sitchin's reading were the inhabitants of this planet, technologically advanced beings who arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago for a very specific and urgent reason. The reason was gold. According to Sitchin's interpretation of the Sumerian text, Nibiru was experiencing a catastrophic deterioration of its atmosphere, a slow environmental collapse that threatened the planet's habitability. The Nibirian scientists determined that the only solution was to seed the upper atmosphere with fine particles of gold, which would reflect incoming radiation and stabilize the planetary climate in the way that aerosol particles sometimes affect Earth's climate following major volcanic eruptions. Gold was the solution, and the solar system's richest source of accessible gold was the third planet from the Sun. The Anunnaki landed on Earth in Mesopotamia and established mines, initially in Africa's gold-rich geological formations, particularly in southern Africa, where Sitchin identified what he described as an ancient mining operation that predated known human civilization. The work was done by a lower caste of Anunnaki laborers who toiled in the mines for hundreds of thousands of years under conditions of increasing hardship. Eventually, according to the narrative, they revolted, a cosmic labor rebellion, and the ruling Anunnaki were faced with a crisis: how to continue the gold mining operation without a workforce willing to do the labor. Their solution was genetic engineering. The Anunnaki chief scientist Enki and his sister Ninhursag worked to create a kind of being, a primitive worker, created in the image of the Anunnaki, but genetically modified to be more obedient, more physically suited to labor, and reproductively capable in ways that would allow the workforce to sustain itself. They accomplished this by combining Anunnaki genetic material with that of Homo erectus, the hominid already present on Earth. The result, after many failed experiments described in the Sumerian text as the creation of monsters and malformed beings, was Homo sapiens, modern humanity. In Sitchin's reading, the biblical story of the Garden of Eden is a mythological echo of this genetic modification. Humans created to serve, living in a managed environment, forbidden from acquiring the knowledge that would make them equal to their creators. The Anunnaki ruled over their human workforce for hundreds of thousands of years. The narrative continues, establishing the first civilization in Mesopotamia, teaching humans agriculture, writing, law, and mathematics, the gifts of civilization that appear so suddenly in the archaeological record around 5000 to 3000 BCE. The great Sumerian cities, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, were built to service the Anunnaki, who resided in their temples like gods, because, in Sitchin's framework, that is what they are. Each city was assigned to a specific Anunnaki deity. Enki ruled Eridu, Enlil governed Nippur, and Nana claimed Uruk. The wars between Sumerian city-states were reflections of factional conflicts between Anunnaki rivals. The Great Flood of Mesopotamian mythology, the deluge that the Sumerian king Zusudra, the Babylonian Utnapishtim, and the biblical Noah all survive in their respective versions, is, in Sitchin's framework, a deliberate event. Nibiru's periodic return to the inner solar system would cause gravitational and tidal disturbances that the Anunnaki knew would trigger massive flooding. Enlil, who had grown contemptuous of the humans, who had multiplied beyond the Anunnaki's original designs, saw the flood as an opportunity to erase the human experiment and start again. Enki, who had created humanity and felt a bond with his creation, secretly warned Zusura to build a vessel and preserve the genetic material of all living things. The flood came. Most of humanity died. The survivors were used to rebuild civilization, which explains why the cultural achievements of the post-flood civilizations, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, appear to emerge so quickly and so sophisticatedly because the Anunnaki supervised and accelerated the reconstruction. Now, how does this connect to Derinkuyu? In this interpretive framework, the underground cities of Cappadocia are understood as shelters built either by or for humans in anticipation of events that the Anunnaki could predict. The periodic return of Nibiru, with its gravitational disruption, catastrophic floods, possibly impact events triggered by debris in the path of Nibiru's orbit. The stone doors of Derinkuyu, in this reading, were not keeping out Arab cavalry. They were engineered against something of a different order entirely, the kind of force that required a sealed, self-sufficient underground space capable of sustaining thousands of people indefinitely. The sophisticated ventilation, the sealed water supply, the nested defensive layers, the food storage for years rather than weeks, all of it looks, in this framework, like the engineering of a survival vessel, not a military fortification, but a lifeboat. The Anunnaki connection to Cappadocia specifically is sometimes amplified by reference to the broader geography of ancient Mesopotamian and Near Eastern civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates originate in the highlands of Anatolia, making that plateau the hydrological heartland of the Fertile Crescent. The high dry plateau of Cappadocia, above the major river systems far from the coast above the floodlines, would be precisely where a technologically sophisticated civilization planning for a global flood event might choose to build its underground survival infrastructure. Professional Assyriologists and Sumerologists, scholars who have spent careers learning to read cuneiform, reject Sitchin's translations comprehensively, arguing that his readings are not alternative interpretations of ambiguous texts, but fundamental mistranslations that produce meanings the original scribes could not have intended. The word Anunnaki in conventional translation carries no connotation of extraterrestrial origin. Nibiru appears in Babylonian astrological texts as a term for the planet Jupiter or for a specific star used in navigation, not as a rogue planet on an eccentric orbit. The Sumerian creation myth, in the conventional translation, described the fashioning of humanity from clay, a metaphor for the shaping of mortal being, not genetic engineering in a laboratory. Nevertheless, Sitchin's framework has generated an enormous following that cuts across cultural boundaries and has reshaped popular understanding of ancient Mesopotamia for millions of readers worldwide. Whether or not it is archaeologically sound, it asks a question that is genuinely worth sitting with. What if the sudden appearance of sophisticated civilization in the Sumerian record around 5000 to 3000 BCE requires more explanation than the standard narrative provides? The Hollow Earth. A different tradition situates Derinkuyu not as a shelter from something above, but as a connection to something below. The inhabited inner earth, known as Agartha, Shambhala, or simply the Hollow Earth, has a long history in both Eastern and Western esoteric thought. Its first quasi-scientific formation in the West came from Edmund Halley in 1692, who proposed to the Royal Society that the Earth might consist of nested concentric shells with an interior illuminated by its own luminous atmosphere, as an attempt to explain anomalous geomagnetic data. The idea was taken up in the 19th and 20th centuries by occultists and theosophists, including Helena Blavatsky, who incorporated the Tibetan Buddhist concept of Shambhala, a hidden kingdom of enlightened beings, into a cosmological framework featuring an inhabited inner world, accessible through cave systems at the poles and at special surface locations. Applied to Cappadocia, this tradition holds that the underground cities are not simply man-made shelters, but access points to a much deeper network, one extending beyond anything officially acknowledged. The unexcavated lower levels of Derinkuyu are central to this. What is below the 18th level? What lies at the end of the untraversed 9-kilometer tunnel to Kaymakli? The absence of complete information is where these possibilities breathe. The beings said to inhabit the inner earth, sometimes called Agarthans, sometimes described as survivors of Atlantis or Lemuria, who retreated underground before the destruction of their civilizations, are typically characterized as spiritually and technologically advanced, having had millennia of isolation in which to develop wisdom and capability that surface humanity has not reached. Some accounts describe encounters accessed through Cappadocian cave system, meetings in the deep dark, that left the human participants profoundly changed. These accounts are not verifiable. They belong to a tradition of mythical experience rather than documented archaeology. But they point to something real about what deep underground spaces do to human perception. In the absence of external light and sound, in the absolute stillness of rock that has not moved in millions of years, the nervous system behaves differently. Ancient peoples knew this and used it deliberately. The oracle at Delphi sat in a chasm from which gases rose. Shamanic traditions across cultures used caves' darkness as a space for vision and transformation. The Derinkuyu experience, for ancient and modern visitors alike, is not simply architectural. It is something stranger and more difficult to name. The Ant People. Among the most structurally compelling parallels applied to Derinkuyu is the Hopi concept of the Anu Sinam, the Ant People. In the Hopi emergence narrative, when the first world was destroyed by fire and the third world by flood, it was the Ant People who sheltered the Hopi's ancestors underground. They carved out chambers, shared their food, rationed carefully, so the refugees could eat while they themselves survived on minimal nourishment. When the destruction above had passed, the Hopi emerged into the new world. The parallels to Derinkuyu's function are striking. Underground shelter, careful food storage and rationing for extended stays, emergence when the surface becomes safe. Some researchers in the ancient astronaut tradition have proposed that the Ant People were literal extraterrestrials, noting that the physical description of ants, large eyes, elongated limbs, a small slide frame, maps onto the most commonly described gray alien archetype in modern UFO contact literature. In this reading, the same beings were operating globally, providing underground shelters for human populations during periods of cosmic catastrophe. The anthropological reading is less dramatic, but equally interesting. Human cultures on opposite sides of the globe independently arrived at the same survival strategy. The story of the Ant People may be a mythological encoding of a real practice, a narrative technology for preserving and transmitting the knowledge of how to go underground and live. The parallel between the Hopi myth and the Cappadocian archaeological record would then be not coincidence, not extraterrestrial coordination, but convergent human wisdom. the same answer discovered independently to the same ancient question. Ancient nuclear war in Mohenjo-Daro. A more specifically technological alternative connects Derinkuyu to evidence of extreme heat events at certain ancient sites, most notably Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley. One of the great urban centers of the ancient world, Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned around 1900 BCE under circumstances still debated. The city shows evidence of sudden end. Streets littered with unburied bodies, material culture left in place as if the inhabitants fled without warning. In certain areas, researchers in the 1970s and 1980s reported vitrified material, stone and brick, appearing to have been fused by extraordinary heat, and skeletal remains, showing cellular damage they characterized as consistent with radiation exposure. Some researchers drawing on passages in the Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, describing weapons of devastating power, a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, interpreted these findings as evidence of an ancient thermonuclear exchange. In this framework, Derinkuyu and the other underground cities of Cappadocia were fallout shelters built against the radiation, firestorms, and nuclear winter of an ancient atomic war. The vitrification at Mohenjo-Daro has been attributed by most archaeologists to ordinary high-temperature industrial or domestic fires, pottery kiln, burning structures. The skeletal remains do not, on more recent analysis, show the specific cellular signatures expected from high radiation exposure. The abandonment of the city is better explained by environmental factors, particularly changes in the Indus River system. But what the nuclear war theory articulates, regardless of its evidentiary basis, is a very specific kind of dread, the dread of technology turning against its creator. This is not an ancient anxiety. It is a modern one, projected backward onto the past. The image of Derinkuyu as a fallout shelter, which is simultaneously anachronistic and perfectly coherent, as a psychological response to a city that does, in fact, function like one. The flood myths. Nearly every major ancient civilization has a flood myth. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh gives us Utnapishtim, a survivor of a divine flood. The Hebrew Bible gives us Noah. Hindu texts give us Manu. Greek mythology gives us Deucalion and Pyrrha. Chinese mythology gives us the great flood tamed by Gun and his son Yu. The Hopi tradition describes the destruction of a world by water. Indigenous peoples, from the Aztecs to the Aboriginal Australians, carry similar stories. This cross-cultural convergence has led researchers to ask whether flood myths preserve a cultural memory of a real event, specifically the catastrophic sea level rise that occurred at the end of the last ice age, between approximately 20,000 and 7,000 years ago. As the Pleistocene ice sheets melted and global sea levels rose by roughly 120 meters, coastal civilizations, which must have been widespread given the coastal environments are among the richest for food, would have been slowly inundated. The flooding of the Black Sea Basin, which some researchers propose occurred catastrophically around 7,600 years ago, when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus and filled what had been a large freshwater lake, would have displaced enormous populations, and could plausibly be one origin of the flood narrative tradition. If real flood events of sufficient scale occurred within human memory, the construction of underground shelters in high-altitude continental regions, like the Cappadocian Plateau, would be a rational response. The plateau at over 1,000 meters above sea level was not itself at risk, but people who had witnessed coastal inundation or who carried its memory might have understood the underground as insurance against whatever catastrophe came next, whether water, fire, or something falling from the sky. What all of these theories share, beneath their different vocabularies and different evidentiary standards, is a response to a real condition, the condition of not fully knowing. Derinkuyu's deepest origins are unconfirmed. Its lower levels are unexplored. Its builders left no written account of their intentions. More than half of it has not been excavated. The uncertainty is real. The mystery is real. The standard explanation, that it was built by the Phrygians for defensive purposes and expanded by Byzantine Christians, is the best supported explanation available. But it is not a complete explanation. It does not account for the possibility of earlier construction. It does not fully address why this community in this landscape produced an underground city of this scale and sophistication rather than simply building stronger walls. It does not explain why the deepest levels go as deep as they do, when far shallower constructions would have been adequate for the documented threats. These are genuine questions. They live in the space between what archaeology has established and what it cannot yet confirm. The French theories rush into that space with specific and dramatic answers. The conventional narrative fills it more slowly, with more caution, and with the acknowledgement that some questions may not be resolved in our lifetimes. Derinkuyu itself offers no guidance on which interpretation to prefer. The Tuff holds all of them equally, with the same patience it has brought to everything asked of it across the millennia: the prayers and the theories, the lamplight and the flashlights, the armies that never found it, and the tourists who wander through it today, with the same absolute mineral equanimity. We are left, as we are always left, by the greatest ancient places, to decide what we believe. Chapter 19, Derinkuyu Today. Modern Derinkuyu is a small ordinary town. A mosque, a market, ordinary houses, a population of around 10,000. Nothing about it from the surface suggests what lies beneath. You pay an entrance fee. You follow signs or a guide down into the earth. The temperature drops. The sounds of the surface disappear. You are in the Tuff. The passages are narrow as designed. You walk single file through corridors that nearly touch your shoulders on both sides. You duck through low doorways into rooms of varying size. The barrel-vaulted missionary school, the stables with their tethering rings, the wine press, the blackened kitchen ceiling, the church with its cruciform plan. You see the stone door roll to the one side of the passage, half a metric ton of rock that has rested in that position for centuries. And you understand immediately why no invaders ever forced one. You lean over the well shaft and feel cool air rising from the dark below. If you go quiet, if you let other visitors fade, if you rest your hand on the cool stone and breathe, you might feel for a moment the weight of the place, The hands that shaped this rock, the thousands of people who sheltered here and survived, the prayers and the bread and the sleeping children and the oil lamps burning in the dark, the Phrygian pick that first broke through into this chamber, the Byzantine mason who carved the arch of the church, the Cappadocian Greek who rolled the stone door closed for the final time and did not know it would not be opened again for 40 years. The city is still here, more than half of it unexcavated, waiting in the dark beneath the modern town. The tuff holds the shape of every chamber ever carved in it. The rock has not moved. Above ground, the world has changed beyond recognition. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have been born and died. The people who carved this place are not here anymore, not in body, not in language. The Cappadocian Greek dialect, spoken by the last inhabitants of this city, is critically endangered. Only a few hundred elderly speakers remain, scattered across Greece, heirs of a diaspora that began at the port of Mersin in 1923. But the well is here, still breathing cool air up from the water table. The church is here, its niches empty of icons, but shaped still by the hands that carved them. The stone door is here, patient as the rock it was cut from. If you go very quiet in the deepest levels, in the dim part where the sound of other tourists has faded, you can almost feel the city breathing. A faint movement of air through the ventilation shafts, the mineral smell of ancient tuff, the absolute stillness of stone that has not moved in millennia. Derinkuyu is still here, beneath the earth, patient as stone. It is still here.